They were hailed as saviors of Rome, worshipped as living legends, and feared as gods of war. But behind the shining armor and glorious victories lay betrayal, greed, and blood-soaked secrets that even Rome dared to hide. This is the untold reality of Rome's most powerful generals. Rome celebrated war as the highest expression of greatness. Victories were not just military achievements, they were public spectacles that defined the Republic's identity. When a general returned from a successful campaign, the Senate could grant him the ultimate honor, a triumph. This was no simple parade. It was a lavish procession through the streets of Rome, with soldiers carrying spoils of war, exotic animals, and chained prisoners. At its center stood the victorious commander, crowned with laurel, hailed as the embodiment of Roman virtue. Citizens lined the roads, cheering, throwing flowers, and chanting the name of their savior. To the people, these men seemed larger than life, guardians of Rome's destiny. Yet behind the applause lay a darker truth. Triumphs were not just rewards, they were political weapons. Generals used the wealth and prestige of conquest to gain influence, often bypassing the Senate's authority. Men like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla rose not only because of their battlefield successes, but because they turned victory into a stage for power. Military glory masked the corruption beneath. Soldiers were rewarded with land and riches, binding their loyalty to commanders instead of the Republic. For the Senate, these triumphs were a double-edged sword. They celebrated Rome's supremacy, but they also elevated individuals to dangerous heights. The Republic prided itself on collective rule, yet generals returning from distant provinces were becoming more than leaders. They were becoming icons with personal armies. This imbalance eroded the foundations of Roman politics. The illusion was clear. While generals appeared to defend Rome, many were laying the groundwork for its downfall. Their victories brought temporary pride, but also introduced wealth, ambition, and private loyalty that would destabilize the Republic. Rome saw them as saviors, but history reveals them as figures whose pursuit of glory often came at the expense of the state itself. In the Roman Republic, generals were not born from the battlefield alone. Their rise was a complex fusion of politics, wealth, and personal ambition. Military command was not automatically granted to the most skilled soldier. It was a political prize, awarded by the Senate to those who had maneuvered their way into favor. The cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices, was the traditional path. Yet, the true ascent required something far greater: resources to fund campaigns, connections to secure votes, and ambition powerful enough to challenge rivals. In the Roman Republic, generals were not born from the battlefield alone. Their rise was a complex fusion of politics, wealth, and personal ambition. Military command was not automatically granted to the most skilled soldier. It was a political prize, awarded by the Senate to those who had maneuvered their way into favor. The cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices, was the traditional path. Yet, the true ascent required something far greater: resources to fund campaigns, connections to secure votes, and ambition powerful enough to challenge rivals. The Senate held theoretical control, but its members often manipulated command appointments for their own advantage. Generals, in turn, learned to exploit both the Senate and the people. Victories abroad brought loot and land, which could be distributed to soldiers or used to finance political careers back in Rome. Warfare became less about the defense of the Republic and more about the personal advancement of those who led its armies. Few figures illustrate this more clearly than Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Rising to prominence during the Second Punic War, he became Rome's answer to Hannibal. At just 24, he was granted command in Spain, an extraordinary decision that broke precedent. His charisma, tactical brilliance, and political maneuvering culminated in the decisive victory at Zama in 202 BCE. The triumph secured Rome's dominance over Carthage, but it also elevated Scipio to near-mythic status, unsettling Rome's political balance. A century later, Gaius Marius demonstrated another path. A new man, without noble lineage, he used military reforms to build power. By recruiting landless citizens into the legions, Marius created armies more loyal to him than to the state. His unprecedented 7 consulships reflected both his military success and his ability to bend political traditions to his will. The rise of these generals signaled a transformation. Commanders were no longer temporary servants of the Republic. They were becoming power brokers, using military victories to carve their own place above the very system that had created them. Roman generals did not march to war solely to defend the Republic. Increasingly, campaigns were launched as instruments of personal ambition, designed to secure wealth, fame, and political dominance. Each conquest brought plundered riches, new lands, and the loyalty of soldiers whose fortunes depended not on the state, but on their commander's generosity. The Republic system fueled this cycle. Victorious generals were expected to distribute spoils among their men and use their newfound wealth to finance political careers in Rome. Success in war became the gateway to power at home, and failure meant political ruin. As competition intensified, generals pursued ever larger campaigns, not for strategic necessity, but for the personal rewards victory could offer. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, exemplified this pursuit in the eastern Mediterranean. In the 60s BCE, his campaigns against Mithridates VI of Pontus and the sweeping reorganization of the East brought Rome vast new provinces, immense treasure, and unprecedented prestige for Pompey himself. He returned to Rome in 61 BCE, his soldiers enriched, his reputation towering. Though he portrayed his actions as service to the Republic, his eastern settlement expanded his personal influence far more than it strengthened Rome's stability. Julius Caesar's ambition in Gaul went even further. Appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum in 58 BCE, Caesar saw an opportunity for conquest that could transform his career. Over nearly a decade, his campaigns extended Roman control to the Atlantic and across the Rhine. The spoils were immense, vast sums of money, hundreds of thousands of captives sold into slavery, and the loyalty of hardened legions. By promising land and wealth, Caesar bound his soldiers' allegiance to him personally. His Commentari de Bello Gallico not only recorded these victories, but carefully shaped his public image, ensuring that glory on the battlefield translated directly into political power in Rome. For both Pompey and Caesar, war was less about defense than about transformation. Campaigns created fortunes, secured fame, and turned generals into figures whose personal power rivaled the authority of the Republic itself. Beneath the banners of Rome, blood was spilled not only for empire, but for ambition. Rome's history was defined not only by victories abroad, but by betrayals within. The Republic, built on shared governance, was repeatedly torn apart by generals who turned against allies, rivals, and even the state itself. Personal ambition overshadowed collective duty, and the loyalty of armies was often the deciding factor in Rome's destiny. The rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla exposed the fragility of the Republic. Marius, celebrated for his military reforms and victories over the Cimbri and Teutones, reshaped the legions by recruiting Rome's poorest citizens. His soldiers fought for him, not the Senate. Sulla, once his subordinate, rose to prominence during the Social War of 91 to 88 BCE. When command of the campaign against Mithridates VI was stripped from Sulla and handed to Marius, Sulla did the unthinkable. In 88 BCE, he marched his legions on Rome itself, the first Roman general to turn his army against the city. The betrayal shattered tradition and set a precedent for civil war. Marius reclaimed power briefly, but the cycle of vengeance between the two men left the Republic scarred. A generation later, the partnership and rivalry of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great brought Rome once again to the brink. Initially, allies within the First Triumvirate, their union of convenience collapsed as Caesar's conquests in Gaul elevated his power. Pompey, once the dominant figure, aligned with the Senate to preserve his authority. The Senate's demand that Caesar disband his army in 49 BCE was the breaking point. Caesar refused, crossing the Rubicon with a single legion, an act of open defiance that ignited civil war. These betrayals were not isolated feuds. They reshaped Roman politics permanently. The Republic's institutions proved powerless when confronted with generals who commanded the loyalty of entire armies. What began as personal rivalries escalated into civil wars that eroded the foundations of Roman governance, marking the beginning of the Republic's end. Since the expulsion of its last monarch, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BCE, Rome prided itself on its hatred of kingship. The very word rex was synonymous with tyranny. Yet, as the Republic expanded, its most successful generals accumulated powers and loyalties that made them indistinguishable from monarchs in all but name. On campaign, a general wielded near absolute authority. He commanded legions, dispensed justice, and controlled vast resources. Soldiers looked to him not as a temporary magistrate of the Senate, but as their direct protector and provider. In return for loyalty, he offered spoils, land, and the promise of security after years of service. Gradually, this bond eclipsed allegiance to the Republic itself. Gaius Marius had first set the precedent by recruiting Rome's poorest into the army and tying their futures to him personally. His soldiers marched not for abstract ideals of Rome, but for the man who promised them survival. Lucius Cornelius Sulla advanced this reality further. During his dictatorship beginning in 82 BCE, he ruled with powers no different from those of a king, using his legions to enforce prescriptions and reshape the political order according to his will. By the 1st century BCE, the phenomenon had reached its peak. Julius Caesar's legions in Gaul saw him less as a commander of Rome than as a sovereign in his own right. Their loyalty was absolute, forged through years of shared conquest and rewards. When he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, his soldiers followed without hesitation, not because the Senate commanded it, but because Caesar did. Rome's paradox was clear. The Republic feared kingship above all else, yet in its most powerful generals, it had created warlords who embodied the very thing it despised. The Republic still spoke of liberty, but its armies marched under men who ruled as kings in disguise. Behind every triumph celebrated in Rome stood a far darker reality. The pursuit of glory by ambitious generals left a trail of devastation that scarred not only enemies of Rome, but also its own soldiers, slaves, and civilians. The cost of their victories was paid in human lives, suffering, and despair. For the Roman soldier, loyalty came with brutal demands. Campaigns stretched for years across distant frontiers. Veterans often returned with broken bodies, scars of war, and uncertain futures. Many were promised land in exchange for service, yet these grants depended on their commander's ability to force legislation through the Senate. Their loyalty was purchased, but their lives were expendable. Thousands were cut down in foreign lands, their sacrifices remembered only as stepping stones in their general's rise to power. The conquered fared even worse. When Julius Caesar besieged the Gallic stronghold of Alesia in 52 BCE, the scale of destruction was staggering. Starvation consumed the trapped population as Caesar's legions constructed massive fortifications to seal them in. When the city finally fell, tens of thousands were slaughtered and survivors were sold into slavery. The victory secured Caesar's dominance in Gaul, but it also demonstrated the brutality required to feed Rome's ambitions. For the people of Gaul, it was not liberation, but annihilation. Crassus's ill-fated campaign against Parthia in 53 BCE showed another side of this cost. Driven by greed and the hope of matching the glory of Caesar and Pompey, he led his legions deep into foreign territory with little preparation. At Carrhae, Roman forces were decimated by Parthian cavalry. More than 20,000 soldiers were killed, another 10,000 captured, and the survivors marched into slavery in distant lands. Crassus himself perished, his ambition ending not in triumph, but humiliation. For his men, the gamble of one man's hunger for power meant annihilation. For civilians across conquered territories, massacres, enslavement, and the destruction of entire communities were routine consequences of Roman conquest. Generals celebrated their victories with laurel crowns and triumphal parades, while the human wreckage was erased from memory. The Republic glorified conquest, but in truth, every triumph rested on untold suffering. The greatest threat to Rome was never a foreign enemy, not Carthage, not Parthia, not even the fierce tribes of Gaul or Germania. The deepest wound came from within. Rome's civil wars, driven by ambition, pride, and rivalry, turned citizen against citizen and legion against legion. By the 1st century BCE, the Republic had grown too vast, its political machinery strained. Ambitious generals, enriched by conquest, returned to Rome not as servants of the state, but as masters of armies loyal to them alone. The Senate, divided by faction, failed to contain them. It was a dangerous balance, power without restraint, ambition without limits. Into this storm stepped Julius Caesar, a brilliant commander in Gaul. He forged legions who adored him, bound by victory and loyalty. But back in Rome, his enemies in the Senate saw him as a threat to the Republic's survival. In 49 BCE, when the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army, he faced a choice: surrender his power or challenge the state itself. On a cold January night, Caesar made his decision. Leading the 13th Legion, he crossed the Rubicon River. It was a small stream in northern Italy, but symbolically, it was the point of no return. To cross it armed was treason, an open declaration of civil war. According to ancient sources, Caesar uttered the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Rome once feared Hannibal's elephants at her gates, but now the city trembled at the march of her own sons. Caesar's legions clashed with those of Pompey the Great, his former ally turned rival. Battles erupted across Italy, Greece, Egypt, and Spain. The Republic, already weakened, bled itself dry in wars fought not for survival, but for supremacy. The cost was immense. Thousands of Romans perished, not at the hands of barbarians, but at the swords of fellow citizens. When Caesar finally stood victorious, crowned dictator for life, the Republic was effectively dead. Rome had devoured itself, and the world's greatest empire was born from its own civil strife. Power in Rome was a prize few could resist, yet for the men who reached its summit, the cost was often their lives. Julius Caesar, the most brilliant commander of his age, secured victory after victory, conquering Gaul, crossing the Rubicon, and defeating Pompey. But absolute power came with absolute resentment. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, in the Senate itself, Caesar was cut down by men he once trusted, Brutus, Cassius, and others who believed they were saving the Republic. His fall revealed the peril of grasping too tightly at Rome's crown. Pompey the Great, once hailed as Rome's champion, fared no better. He had marched in triumph, cleared the seas of pirates, and expanded Rome's reach. Yet his alliance with Caesar and Crassus collapsed into rivalry. Defeated in the civil war, Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking safety under a king he had helped secure on the throne. Instead, he was betrayed. As he stepped ashore in 48 BCE, assassins struck him down. His severed head was sent to Caesar, a final insult to a man who had commanded empires. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, sought glory to match his wealth. But ambition drove him east against Parthia. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, his legions were crushed by superior cavalry. Crassus himself was captured and killed, his defeat leaving a stain that Rome could never fully erase. Three men, Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, had formed the First Triumvirate, binding themselves together to rule. Yet each died violently, undone not only by enemies, but by the very power they pursued. Their ends stood as a warning. In Rome, the higher the climb, the sharper the fall. The legacy of Rome's generals stretched far beyond the collapse of the empire. Their strategies, forged on battlefields from Gaul to the east, became the foundation of Western military doctrine for centuries. From Caesar's use of rapid mobility to Scipio's reliance on discipline and formation, European commanders studied Rome not merely for inspiration, but as a manual for power. Yet the lesson carried a darker imprint. Ambition often outweighed loyalty. Generals who once fought for the Republic turned their legions into personal armies, seizing power through force rather than service. This pattern echoed across monarchies and empires that followed, where loyalty to the state was often fragile compared to loyalty to a leader. Rome's glory illuminated the heights of conquest, but its corruption cast long shadows. The triumphs of its generals faded into memory, while the precedent of military power over civil order remained, a warning carved deep into the history of the West.